Hello everybody and welcome to another video in the Simplified opening series. In this video I would like to show you a very simple, straightforward repertoire for black against all possible Scotch lines, gambits and deviations that white can try. This was in fact asked by one of the subscribers, so yeah, I'm slowly trying to fulfill your wishes, as I already announced that paid subscribers to my Substack can ask for content they would like to be analyzed on my video series. So the Scotch Gambit and alike are probably a nuisance for a lot of black players because they involve a lot of sharp lines, tactics that the white player usually enjoys and has studied, but black, having to dedicate a lot of time to other lines as well, probably hasn't had the time to study in greater detail. So in this video I would like to show you how you can actually diffuse all of these lines in a very simple, straightforward manner, and what I think is most important is that it's a very low maintenance theoretically. So without further ado, let me show you what I have in mind. So after e4, e5, knight f3, knight e6, d4, e4. Now white has three main attempts. The proper Scotch is after knight takes d4, but the sacrificial lines start with moves like c3 or bishop c4. I will start with the move c3. Obviously it's a pawn sacrifice, but this is like the most easily diffused by the central advanced d5. Another very solid option is the move knight f6, attacking the knight on e4, and after e5, knight d5. It's also very safe, very easy position for black. This one can also arise from the Ponziani opening, but d5 I think is by far the easiest way, and I think so because also affects white psychologically. The point of this is that the main line that I'm going to show you leads by force to an endgame which is very comfortable and pleasant for black. So the problem for white in this situation is that instead of getting these exciting sacrificial positions, he will have to defend a slightly unfavorable endgame. So e takes d5, queen takes d5, c takes d4, and bishop g4. So black plays in a pretty aggressive manner, pinning the knight on f3, intending long castle, and then targeting this pawn on d4. So like I said, plays rather forced. Knight c3, attacking the queen, but the queen does not go back. Bishop b4, developing with tempo, pinning the knight on c3. Bishop e2, breaking the pin on the knight on f3. And now this is the key moment for black. In this variation, white threatens to castle. So this can be served like a cue. So the idea here is to prevent castling, and that is done by taking on f3. Bishop takes f3. Now bishop takes f3, attacking the queen. So now not queen d4, bishop c6 check, and then black loses the queen. But remember, we need to prevent castling, and we do that by the move queen c4. And this is becoming problematic for white very quickly if he does not react immediately, because the threat is long castle, the pawn on d4 is hanging. So bishop c3 is also a threat. So white again is forced to seek exchanges. So bishop takes e6, b takes e6, still preventing castling and threatening maybe long castle, maybe, or knight e7 or short castle, or bishop c3, or queen e2 check, take on e2, king e2, long castle. And this is a fantastic endgame for black because these two pawns on c7 and c6 are actually quite useful in controlling squares in the center, mostly d5, b5, and they are much easier to defend than white's isolated queen's pawn on d4. So after something like bishop e3, let's say, defending the pawn on d4, knight e7, and ideas like knight f5, targeting the bishop, targeting the pawn, rook h e8, the endgame is really, really pleasant. But what I said, I think is the most important, is that white does not get to attack. So now let's go back. So that's how we deal with c3. Let's deal with the bishop c4, the trappy line. The main moves here are knight f6 and bishop c5, after which white has various attempts how to create some mess on the board. Objectively, of course, black is in very good shape, but you need to know your theory and remember it well. So what I'm suggesting here is actually you could even say the dullest, the most primitive move in the position, but on the other hand, a move that effectively eliminates all necessity for remembering forcing lines or defenses against white sacrificial attempts. So the move I'm talking about is the move d6. And yeah, looks silly, looks dull, but on the other hand, there are no aggressive attacking sacrificial lines for white. So you have the pros and you have the cons. So now the main move by far for white is just to take on d4, and then we will have a transposition to one line of the Philidor defense. But before going on that, let's explore white insisting on sacrificing something. Yeah, so you just imagine you're playing some gung-ho player who just wants to sacrifice something for the thrill of it. Yeah, so c3. It's possible to take the pawn, but you just want to frustrate our opponent, and we go knight f6. And now just targeting the pawn on e4. Now let's say white goes castling, still sacrificing a pawn on e4. But before that, let's also check queen b3. Yeah, white is really insisting on playing in some gambit style, but queen d7, defending the pawn on f7 and threatening knight a5, targeting the queen and the bishop. The queen is useful on d7 to prevent any checks from the a4 e8 diagonal. Now, for example, knight g5 is just bad because knight e5 targets the bishop and defends the pawn on f7, so the knight on g5 is out of place. So white should actually castle, and then black collects the light squared bishop, knight a5, queen b4, takes, bishop e7, castles with a very safe position. Pair of bishops, long-term prospects. Black is equal without problems. So let's go back, let's say castle. And now again, ignore the pawn, just develop bishop b7. And now after cd4, now already white threatens to go knight c3, for example, to defend the pawn on e4, and then he will have an advantage thanks to this pawn center. But with the e file closed, now it is possible to take the pawn on e4. Yeah, now the threat is d5 to solidify the knight and remain a clear pawn up. So the only move for white is d5, but now knight e5, attacking the bishop and initiating exchanges. Again, this is very safe for black, simply because in any moment when danger arises, he can simply castle and get the king out of the center. Now, a forcing line is knight takes e5, d takes e5, rook e1. White must try to get the pawn back, otherwise black just castles and is better. Knight drops back to d6 with tempo, attacking the bishop. And now white should take the pawn. Rook takes e5, knight c4, queen a4 check. Yeah, regaining the piece, but after bishop d7, queen c4 castle, this is already more pleasant for black. Pair of bishops, better structure, IQP on d5. Yeah, so already pretty promising for black long term, and most importantly very safe. So the c3 lines don't really work. After d6, so white should actually go knight takes d4, and after knight f6, attacking the pawn on e4, knight c3, bishop e7, castles. We have landed in a pretty not that common line in the Philidor defense when black takes on d4 early on. And I would say this is some sort of an accomplishment for black, because in that line of the Philidor after third move e takes d4, the plans with bishop c4 are not really considered that critical. The most critical lines against e4, knight d4 early on in the Philidor is the line with g3 and bishop g2 for white. So that's the most annoying line for, and the most annoying line for black, and best line for white. And that is the reason why this early e takes d4 Philidor kind of lost its allure. But now with bishop on c4, it's quite acceptable for black. The engine always gives some slight advantage to white, but this is a very playable position, and like I stress again, it's very safe for black, especially taking into consideration that you started the game against a player who wanted to play in some sacrificial style to sacrifice something and mate you quickly. Now in this position, I would like to show you, first I'll explain one general plan that you can play pretty much against everything, and a couple of concrete ideas that you can employ against white's main tries, which are h3 and rook e1. Now the general plan here for black consists of simply going rook e8, bishop f8. This rearrangement of the pieces. And then depending on circumstances, the knight will likely leave c6, maybe knight e5, hitting that bishop on c4, then maybe dropping back to g6, followed by c6, queen c7, maybe b5 if allowed, maybe bishop e6 to exchange the bishop if there is no knight on d4, yeah, or bishop simply d7, rook a d8, just concentrating all the pieces in the center and being ready for any white assault. So this is the general plan that you can always fall back on if you forget any of the concrete lines. So this is the safe, like let's say a reserve plan that you can rely on in case you forget the concrete lines or ideas. So again, this is a very simple solution, basically theory free, because you get to this position and then you remember this rearrangement, rook e8, bishop f8, then move the knight, play c6 and so forth, and you'll get a good safe middle game. But I also want to show you the concrete lines against white's main moves. But before we continue, one more thing I forgot to mention is so you get a more complete understanding of the position, is what happens if white actually exchanges on c6. And after bc6, we have a transformation of the structure. So we have these pawns for black in the center, but the pawn on c6 is quite useful, controlling these two squares d5 and b5, and it can also be useful for one more thing, and I will show you. Let's say rook e1, rook b8, activating the rook. That's another benefit of b takes c6, bishop b3, and now this idea, knight d7. And the idea is actually to go c5, knight b6, threatening c4 to harass this bishop on b3. From b6, the knight is controlling the d5 square, and also it frees the f6 square for the dark squared bishop. So with all these ideas, black is comfortable in these structures. So now let's take a look at the main ideas, main moves also for white. We will start with move h3, and then when we see why h3 is not that great for white, then we will understand why actually the more precise move for white here is rook e1. So h3, natural move, you would say, because it controls the g4 square. Sometimes black can harass the queen with bishop g4 to force f3 perhaps for some weakening, then drop back with the bishop. But the concrete idea in this position comes from the already, let's say, established position of the light squared bishop on c4. So black can take advantage of it by playing knight e5, attacking the bishop. Yeah, the bishop draws back to b3 to stay on the active diagonal, but now c5. And this is the concrete idea you should always have in mind when in these lines with the bishop on c4. Knight e5 hitting the bishop and then c5. Now there is already a trap involved in the position, and that is the natural move knight f5 is actually bad, because bishop takes f5, e takes f5, c4. We already see problems with the bishop. Bishop a4, a6, threatening to trap the bishop. Luckily for white, he doesn't lose a piece after f4, but he does end up in a worse position. Knight c6, bishop c6, bc, then followed by d5. It's clear that black's central pawns are better than white's double pawns on the king side. So this black here already has an advantage. So that's why after c5, white should go knight f3, but c4 still works. So attacking the bishop, knight takes e5, c takes b3, the knight is attacked, so knight drops back to f3, b takes a2, rook a2, and something like, let's say, rook e8. Other moves are possible. And we have this very, let's say, unbalanced position, reminding us of the Sicilian somewhat. And black has the pair of bishops, obviously. The pawn on d6, the Sicilian experience tells us that it's not really a problem, because it's defended safely by the bishop. Then black's play is actually just simply go bishop e6, yeah, then maybe a6, b5, just play on the queen side, b4, queen c7 can come, perhaps execute d5 if possible. The bishop can drop back to f8. So all these moves, h6 also to cover the g5 square. The bishop can also go to d7, c6, or after a6, b5 to b7. A lot of ideas, constructive ideas, but basically meaning that black has good play. Whenever you have a lot of ideas in a position, that means that you do have good play in that position. So now that you get this concrete idea of knight e5, c5, now you understand why rook e1 is more precise. The idea, of course, is that if now knight e5, then bishop f1. Yeah, so the bishop is better on f1 than on e2, blocking the e file, and not on b3. Still, this is possible, yeah, if you really want to just stick to knight e5. And what do? Well, remember the backup plan. You always fall back on that one. So you go just rook e8, h3, bishop f8. Yeah, and again, things are okay. It's a complex middle game. All the pieces are on board. It's safe. It's strategical. So all the fight is ahead. This was played, for example, in the Mamedov Abdusatorov. And curiously enough, this line in the Philidor and against the Scotch Gambits has been played quite a bit by strong players like Abdusatorov, Sadwani, and I also noticed someone else. It was there, Rapport. Yeah, Rapport too. So you can see strong players have been exploring this line. And okay, in this position, Abdusatorov went c6. Then the knight dropped back to g6, bishop queen c7, and a very compact position for black. So you can play knight e5 and go back to the basic plan, if we call it rook e8, bishop f8. But I would like to show you another concrete idea here, and that starts with the move knight takes d4. So knight takes d4, queen takes d4, and now the surprising move knight g4. In a way, you can get the prompt or the cue for this idea based on the fact that the rook is no longer on f1, so there is no defense of f2, because one of black's ideas is actually to go f5, obviously not immediately, yeah, but the knight will drop back to e5 to get rid of the bishop, and then f5. So black wants to start play on the f file. Yeah, so h3, knight e5 with the tempo. Now the bishop must go back, but only on e2, because there are tricks again in the position. Let's say bishop f1 is bad because of the typical tactic bishop h3 winning a pawn, as g takes h3, knight f3 would be quite embarrassing for white. And again, bishop b3 runs into c5, this time hitting the queen, queen d5 and c4. And the trick again is bishop c4, bishop e6, winning a piece, or in case of bishop a4, a6 again, and b5 is going to happen now or later after bishop e6 and b5. And white is in trouble again. So after knight e5, bishop e2 is the only move, and now f5. Again, e takes f5, bishop f5, and it's quite interesting middle game position, quite complex. Black has good play, c2 is hanging, so for example, if white gives check on d5 and takes on b7, black takes on c2. And obviously, pretty sharp position, but black is doing quite alright. So these are the ideas I wanted to show you again in the Philidor. As a way of avoiding Scotch Gambits. So just to let's say summarize what I said, the basic plan, the backup plan is rook e8, bishop f8, but the concrete ideas include knight e5 with c5 and possibly c4, or knight takes d4 with knight g4, knight e5, and then f5 later. So this is basically all you need to know when you play d6 against the Scotch Gambits, and you just deal with all the tactics in just one swoop. So the last thing that remains is the Scotch, okay, and this is quite a big territory, yeah, and unfortunately there is no shortcut solution to the Scotch. That is, let's say, low maintenance, low theory. But I will still show you one line that I think is a bit, I think, well, not that common, and also probably underrated from black's perspective. There is some theory along the way. I'll try to keep it short, but it's a surprising line, and it's again it's a strategic positional line where you can play based on understanding and not so much on memorizing a theory. So the main moves here by far are knight f6, bishop c5, and lately queen f6, but we'll go with bishop b4 check. Yeah? So the first move in a slightly less explored direction. Now c3 is the move. Knight c3, it's possible, but apart from going for the 4 knights Scotch with knight f6, which has quite, it's excellent for black obviously, but also quite, let's say, equal and drawish. You can keep the game more complex if you want by developing the knight to e7. and then you just go d6 short castle, and you get a good middle game with all the pieces on the board, which is also less explored, and objectively it's fine for black. So c3 is the main move, and now bishop c5. And the idea of this check is that after, let's say, knight b3, bishop b6, you could say that black lost a tempo, because in this position the pawn is on c2 if black had played bishop c5 without giving the check. But the point is actually to force that pawn on c3, so knight c3 is no longer possible, which is the main move against bishop c5 in this position. So this is actually, the extra tempo hurts white more than it aids him. So that's one of the, let's say, the main idea at this stage for giving check and then dropping back to c5. Now the main move for white is the move bishop e3. I'll briefly mention the others. Let's say bishop c4, you go d6 and knight e7. Again, good development, no problems, short castle is happening and black is fine. Against knight c6, bc6, bishop d3, you can, again, depend what you want to obtain. If you want simple play without any memorization, you go again knight e7, castle d6 and so forth. If you want to instill some more life in the position, you can try knight queen h4, threatening mate. But here things can get sharp. Queen e2, knight f6, h3, short castle, g3, queen h5, g4, queen e5. For example, this was played in the game Kasparov-Leko in 1997. Kasparov played g5, and now the only move for black not to end up in trouble is knight e8. And after f4, queen e7, it may look a bit scary for black, but in fact, black is already fully developed and white is overextended. Yeah, so for example, let's say f5, f6, and it's pretty unclear. Yeah, takes, and then the queen can come back to e5, so maybe d5 open the center, so it's unclear, but black is doing fine. So that's knight c6. Then let's say knight f5. Yeah, you can just go g6, get rid of the knight, bishop e3, and now you can simply drop back to b6 as in the main line. But I will also mention the game Nakamura-Carlsen, a blitz game from 2018, where Carlsen went bishop f8, and after knight d4, bishop g7, and then just went knight f6 castles again with a very good position. So these are not critical. Bishop e3 is the main move. Bishop drops back to b6. And now again a lot of moves for white, but the only one to actually promise some sort of an advantage is the move knight f5. So again, even though white has a choice, the only move for an advantage is knight f5. I will mention again briefly the others. Queen g4 is one move that you should be aware of, and you can deal with it in depending on your mood. If you're feeling sharp, you can go knight f6, sacrificing the pawn, queen g7, rook g8, queen h6, and now d5. Sharp line, complications, but black is fine. If you just don't want to bother, you just go g6. Yeah, and then just develop with whether queen e7 or queen f6 or knight e7 or knight f6, d6, and so forth. And some sort of a middle way is the move queen f6, defending the pawn on g7 and threatening d6 or d5, attacking the queen. So queen g3. And now the only thing you need to remember is after d6, black is obviously fine if you just allow it to finish development, but there is a sharp line you need to remember if you want to go here, and that starts with knight b5, targeting the pawn on c7. And the sharp line goes bishop takes e3, knight c7 check. Otherwise, black will just go queen e7, defend the pawn on c7. So knight c7 check, king d8, knight a8, and now bishop c1. This is the key move, targeting b2, knight d2, bishop b2, rook d1, and bishop c3. And again, very sharp. Black is down on exchange for a pawn, but this knight on a8 is quite problematic, and if white loses it without any compensation, black will be just winning. So objectively, this is an equal sharp position. You should explore it if you want to go this way, but I'm just saying that this is the line you need to know if you go for queen f6. So then we have moves like, let's say, bishop c4, when you can again go knight e5, which is more concrete, or simply go knight e7 and then just castle d6 and so forth. Yeah, that's the simpler way, or knight e5, and then the bishop drops back, and then you go knight f6, d6, and so forth. Other moves, let's say knight c6, bc6, we already saw this. Bishop d4, queen h4 is an interesting move, but again, you don't need to remember all this. You can simply go knight f6 or even bishop queen g5 defending that pawn. It's nothing really. Meek moves like bishop e2 can be made by knight f6, just defending, developing knight d2 short castle, and you go rook e8, d5. Again, easy play. One curious move, queen a4, introduces this threat of knight takes c6, and whichever way black recaptures, then bishop b6 follows, and a b6 is not possible because the rook is hanging. So understanding this threat, the best move for black is actually rook b8. Yeah, just getting away from the pin, and now any exchange can be made by a b6, and black is obviously fine. And then of course, if white does nothing, then knight f6 or knight e7, short castle d6. Again, pretty automatically. So we covered more, some other moves, g3, bishop d3, again, you just develop normally, you don't have to remember much here. So let's move to the critical move, knight f5, bishop takes c3, knight takes c3, d6, and we are already starting to see the outlines of the position we are going to get. Black is going to develop the knight on e7, and then he will search for counterplay by trying to execute the f5 push. And here, I think that the way for white to play for an advantage is to go for the Morozzi bind structure by playing c4, knight c3, bishop d3, and so forth, establishing control over the d5 square. But the engine suggests something very interesting, and that is the move knight d2. And obviously white is not going to play c4 because then the knight would be better on c3 than on d2. But the engine wants to go for some ideas with long castle. So the queen will move, and then f4, and then maybe long castle, and so forth. So again, the engine also suggests a very interesting antidote, which I think it's worth sharing. So he starts with bishop e6. Okay, already targeting maybe a2, f4. Okay, advancing, and now a very curious move, a6. So we would say, what's going on here, yeah? But okay, it's first some preparation for b5, b4 if white castles long. So the engine suggests, now it's not the time to castle long, why should castle short? So bishop e2, knight f6, short castle. And now comes the second idea of a6, a very fine maneuver known from the games first introduced by Akiba Rubinstein, queen b8. Yeah, so now we see the idea of a6, the queen's coming to a7. And the queen is activated in this not very obvious way. King h1, queen a7, yeah? Targeting the knight. The queen can further come to c5 if necessary, or just stay on a7. Castle short, okay? And again, black has a good position in a pretty complex middle game, yeah? So very, very interesting line. Still, I think c4 is more critical. So knight e7 now. Bishop d3. White can also start with knight c3, but it's still important to put the bishop on d3, because putting it on e2, let's say knight c3 castles bishop e2, f5 is executed, and black is already fine. Yeah. So this was played in the game Nepomniachtchi Kramnik 2014, and a game that actually Kramnik won. This was also played by Nakamura. There is also a game Giri Nakamura played online in 2021. So the idea is to put the bishop on d3. So bishop d3, castles, or knight c3, doesn't really matter. And what we have here, we see if you look at the structure, yeah, we see that white has very good grip on the light squares, but that automatically means that he has less control over the dark squares. So it will be fight light squares versus dark squares. So black starts by planting a knight on the weak square on d4. So knight takes d4, knight c3, and c5. And now you see why I said that this is let's say a low maintenance, low theory approach, because basically black plays on the dark squares. The further development is simple, something like f6, bishop e6, king h8, maybe queen d7, yeah, and eventually seeking perhaps to break with f5, or on the queen side with b5. So what will happen is that white controls the d5 square and black controls the d4 square. But the difference here is in the position of the bishops. And as we know from basic strategy, white's bishop is actually the worst one because it's limited by its own pawns. And this is seen by the fact that, just to illustrate, I'll just put a knight on d5, take, and go bishop e6, and now we see the difference. The difference is that black can give up his bishop for white's dominating knight, and white cannot do the same. So long term, this is black's ideal scenario. Let's just go king h1, take on d5. Yeah, whichever way white takes, we have a great knight against not so great bishop. So this is the long term ideal scenario for black. Obtain a good knight, bad bishop position where he can play for a win. Obviously, white knows what he's doing. This will not really happen, but this is the let's say the end product and goal that black is striving for. So that's why I think, okay, playing positions and middle games where the long-term prospects are in our favor, I think gives some sort of optimism for the future, because the longer the game goes, the bigger the chances of that favorable end scenario actually happens. But the engine still favors white here. Yeah, let's not forget that. And it suggests going f4, f6, part of black's plan, just to stop some f5, f6 ideas by white. And now, interestingly, the engine suggests only one way where white can keep some advantage. Because otherwise, if white doesn't play the way the engine suggests, black simply goes, let's say, bishop e6, king h8, like I explained, yeah? Queen can come to d7, yeah, maybe f5 at some point, maybe a6, b5 at some point. And whenever something appears on d5, black can either ignore it or exchange it, maybe exchange it twice, ideally, and then end up with a good knight versus a bad bishop. So the engine suggests here to play the move knight b5, yeah? Challenging black's centralized knight. And the idea of the move is that if black takes on b5, cb5, this bishop is no longer bad because it can come to c4. And then that is really favorable for white. So black shouldn't comply. So knight ec6, connecting the knights. And now queen h5. Yeah? h6, avoiding some e5, queen h7 threats. Yeah, h6. And now again, the engine suggests a non-obvious maneuver for white, which is queen g6. Okay, still threatening some e5. So knight e7, getting rid of the queen. Queen g3 now. But now black gets f5. So some advantage to white according to the engine, but if you just look at switch the engine off and look at the position, you actually see that this is quite unclear. Very complex position, chances for both sides, I would say. Again, the trumps that black has is the control over the dark squares, but also now after f5 counterplay in the center. Yeah, bishop e6, queen d7 still are very much possible. In case of knight d4, cd4, that pawn on d4 is a passed pawn. Yeah, so pretty much unclear play ahead. So this is what I had in mind when it came to the Scotch and the Gambits and everything else. Well, I hope you found this, let's say, repertoire suggestion curious, interesting. I hope you like it. Maybe you can introduce it to your own repertoire, you start using it, or add it to your existing one. Hopefully the ideas were interesting enough for you to watch this video. So I'll thank you for watching it, and I hope you smash that subscribe button, leave your comments, tell me what you think, like the video, and also don't forget that you can see above, you can subscribe to my Substack, become a paid subscriber, and suggest your topics for my next video. Thanks guys for watching, and it's time for me to sign off, and I'll see you soon again. Take care.